"No," he said quietly. "I'm not mad. I'm surprised. And I'm worried. But I understand why you did it." Tears stung her eyes again. "I just didn't want them to take you away." He reached for her hand and held it gently. "I know," he said. "And I'm glad you were there." They sat like that for a while, letting the weight of the day settle between them. After some time, he stood up. "We should eat something," he said. "Neither of us has had lunch." She nodded, wiping her face quickly. They moved around the kitchen together quietly, preparing something simple. It felt strange to do something normal after everything that had happened, but maybe that was exactly what they needed. The quiet moments helped steady them both. Later, after they finished eating, they sat together again in the living room. The house was peaceful, but the outside world felt unpredictable. She kept replaying the moment she had revealed the card. The officers freezing, the crowd whispering, her brother's expression. Her brother broke the silence. "You know," he said softly, "if you hadn't done what you did, things might have gone very differently." She looked at him, unsure what he meant. He continued, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that, but you kept it from getting worse." Her breath caught. "They didn't believe me at first. They didn't know you," he said gently. "They didn't know the truth." She looked away, feeling a mix of worry and relief. "Tomorrow," he said, "everything will become clearer." "Do you think your job is safe?" she asked. He gave a small smile. "Yes, I didn't do anything wrong, and my team knows me. They know how I work." She nodded, letting the tension in her shoulders ease just a little. "But," he added, "there might be more questions in the next few days. Just be ready for that." She took a deep breath. "I will." He patted her hand gently. "No matter what happens," he said, "we'll handle it." The rest of the evening passed quietly. They talked about other things, trying to shift their minds away from the chaos of the day. But the heaviness never fully left the room as night came. She went to her room and sat at the edge of her bed, thinking about everything that had happened. The fear, the confusion, the decision she had made, and the way her brother had looked at her first in shock, then frustration, and finally with understanding. She didn't regret saving him, but she wondered what tomorrow would bring. In another room, her brother lay awake too, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the officers, the crowd, the card being shown in a place it was never meant to appear, and the call from his department. He didn't blame her for anything, but he knew one thing for certain. The situation was far from over. The moment the officer stepped back from him, the entire street felt different. A few minutes earlier, everything had been tense, loud, and confusing, but now there was a strange quiet around them. People who had gathered were still watching, trying to understand what had just happened. Some people whispered. Others kept their phones raised, still recording, maybe expecting something else to unfold. But the air had shifted. None of the tension from before felt the same. Daniel slowly rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had been. Even though he stayed calm, it was clear he wasn't fully relaxed. His sister stood next to him, her hand shaking just a little, though she tried to hide it. It had been a long and stressful moment for both of them, one they never imagined would happen when they simply walked out that afternoon. The lead officer stepped forward again, but his tone had fully changed. He looked almost unsure of how to approach them now. There was a stiffness in his shoulders that wasn't there before, and he was careful with every word. He apologized, not just once, but 3 or 4 times, each time sounding like he wished he could go back and undo everything. Daniel listened quietly, not interrupting or showing anger, just letting the officer finish. His sister stood next to him, her eyes still wet from earlier. But now she kept looking at her brother as if she was checking that he was okay. She didn't say anything to the officer. She didn't need to. Her expression said enough. It showed relief, frustration, exhaustion, and a quiet strength that had carried her through the entire situation. Daniel took a slow breath before he finally spoke. His voice was calm and steady, but there was a firmness beneath it that couldn't be ignored. He didn't raise his voice or speak harshly. He didn't point fingers or accuse anyone. Instead, He explained plainly and respectfully how important it is for officers to verify identities correctly, especially when things escalate so quickly. He reminded them that mistakes like this could easily lead to real harm, not just for suspects, but for everyone involved. The officers listened, each one of them looking like they were trying to take in every word. It wasn't the kind of lecture meant to embarrass anyone. It was more like a reminder of the responsibilities they carried every single day. The lead officer nodded repeatedly, almost too quickly, as if trying to show he understood. Around them, the crowd began to slowly break apart. Some people left, heading back to whatever they were doing before the scene unfolded. Others stayed but lowered their phones. A few even walked up quietly just to see if the siblings were okay. One woman softly asked his sister if she needed water or a moment to sit down. She thanked her gently, but said she was fine. A pair of older men who had been nearby shook their heads, mumbling to each other about how fast things can get out of hand. A younger person stood a few steps away, wiping their eyes a bit.
The stress of watching everything unfold clearly hasn't gotten to them.
The situation had affected everyone in some way, not just the ones directly involved. After a moment, one officer explained the misunderstanding. He said the suspect description had been vague and rushed, something that had already caused confusion earlier in the day. They had been on edge because the case had been ongoing for some time, and every lead felt urgent. He apologized again, this time specifically to Daniel's sister for not listening to her earlier. His voice softened when he spoke to her, maybe realizing how hard she had fought to be heard. She nodded slowly but didn't say much. Her exhaustion was clear in the way she kept taking long breaths, like she was trying to fully calm herself after everything that had happened. She kept glancing at her brother, probably checking if he needed anything or if he was still upset. Daniel finally stepped closer to her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to let her know that he was okay and that everything was settling down. She looked up at him and managed a small smile, though her eyes were still red from crying earlier. After a few more attempts from the officers to explain themselves, things slowly transitioned into the final part of the ordeal, the formal apologies and the paperwork. The officers took down additional information to file an internal report. They made sure to note the confirmation from the federal team, the misunderstanding, and the events leading to the arrest. Everything had to be recorded properly now. A few minutes later, a pair of officers who hadn't been involved earlier arrived on the scene. They were from a different unit, and they approached with professional calm. They personally apologized to Daniel as well, explaining that the department would thoroughly review what happened. One of them mentioned that this wasn't something they took lightly, that the department would take steps to prevent similar problems in the future. Meanwhile, the mood around the siblings continued to soften. Even people who had been angry earlier now simply seemed relieved that no one had been hurt. A couple of people even gave the siblings supportive nods. No one said anything loud or dramatic. The street simply started returning to the normal sounds of everyday life. After everything was finally cleared up, Daniel and his sister stepped aside so they could talk privately. They didn't go too far, just enough to find a quiet space near a bench. His sister sat down immediately, letting out a long breath while rubbing her face with her hands. He sat next to her and waited a moment before speaking. He asked her if she was all right, his tone soft and caring. She nodded, though her voice shook when she admitted how scared she had been. She had never been in a situation like that before, and even though she tried to stay strong the whole time, she felt like she might fall apart now that it was over. He assured her that she did the right thing, reminding her how brave she had been. She didn't seem to believe it at first, shaking her head slightly, but he insisted. Without her stepping in, he said, the situation might have become even more confused. She had helped protect him when he had no way to defend himself, and that mattered more than anything else. She leaned her head on his shoulder, letting the last bit of stress slowly leave her body. He sat still, letting her take her time, knowing that it was the least he could do after everything she had gone through. They stayed like that for a while, not speaking, just breathing and calming down. Eventually, he stood up and offered her his hand. When she took it, he pulled her gently to her feet. They walked slowly down the sidewalk, moving away from the place where everything had unfolded. The officers were still there, finishing paperwork and discussing what to do next, but the two siblings didn't look back. They didn't need to. It started on a warm afternoon, the kind of day when people filled the sidewalks simply to enjoy the weather. Street vendors called out their usual greetings, children played near the curb, and cars moved slowly through the busy road. But in the middle of all that normalcy, something suddenly changed. A loud commotion rose from one corner of the street. Cutting through the noise like a blade, 2 officers had approached a young man standing outside a small grocery shop. He had been waiting for his sister to finish buying a few things, but the officers suspected he matched the description of someone they were looking for. They stepped up to him with sharp voices and quick movements that instantly attracted the attention of everyone nearby. He wasn't doing anything unusual. He had been standing quietly, scrolling through his phone, but the officers insisted he needed to answer a few questions. He tried to stay calm, asking what this was about, but the officers were already convinced that his calmness was an act. They believed they had found the person they were hunting, as the officers pressed him to put his hands behind his back. He repeated that they were making a mistake. His voice wasn't angry, just confused, almost hurt. He couldn't understand why they were treating him like a criminal. His words, however, didn't slow the officers down. Just then, his sister stepped out of the grocery shop. She had only bought a loaf of bread and a few snacks. The moment she glanced up and saw her brother being restrained, the bag slipped out of her hand and hit the pavement. She rushed toward them, nearly tripping over her own feet. "What are you doing?" He didn't do anything. She shouted as she reached them. Her voice came out louder than she expected because fear pushed it out of her. People nearby started watching. A few took out their phones to record, something that had become instinctive whenever a tense moment involved officers. Cars slowed down as drivers stuck their heads out of their windows. It didn't take long before a full circle of attention formed around them. One of the officers tried to block her with a hand, telling her to stay back, but she refused. She kept repeating that they were mistaken. Her brother kept saying the same, but his calmness was starting to fade. Not because he had done anything wrong, because he could see how frightened his sister was. He didn't want her to panic, and he didn't want this situation to get worse. He kept trying to explain that they were confusing him with someone else. But the more he tried to speak, the less the officers listened. They told him to stop resisting, even though he hadn't resisted at all. His sister felt helpless. She looked around at the crowd, hoping someone would back her up, but no one dared step between officers and a suspect. They only watched. Some whispered to each other. Some filmed silently. Others shook their heads, unsure of who was right or wrong. She tried to breathe, but her chest felt tight. She knew her brother better than anyone. He was responsible, gentle, and careful in every part of his life. The idea of him being mistaken for a criminal felt unreal, like a bad scene from a story she had only heard about happening to others. One officer pulled out a pair of cuffs, and that was the moment her fear exploded. She moved forward again, pleading with them to stop. But they kept telling her to step aside or risk being detained too. The words hit her like a slap. Detained for trying to help her own brother? She stepped back only long enough to gather her thoughts, then pushed forward again. Her hands trembled as she pointed at them and said they needed to check his information properly before making a mistake that couldn't be undone. But the officers had already made up their minds. They said he fit the physical description. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time. He had reacted in a suspicious way by asking too many questions. That was enough for them. Her brother tried to calm her, telling her to breathe and that everything would be okay, but she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He wasn't scared for himself. He was scared for her. She was someone who wore her heart openly. Moments like this crushed her. The officers tried to move him toward the squad car, but she immediately blocked their path. Her voice cracked as she told them they were making a grave mistake. She begged them to double-check before embarrassing themselves. The officers looked annoyed, as if she were just another emotional bystander making things harder. They didn't see that she was protecting someone who had done nothing wrong. They didn't see the truth. One of the officers told her again to move aside. This time his tone was sharper, not angry, but firm enough to show he meant it. She felt a jolt in her stomach, a mix of fear and determination. She knew they would not listen unless she gave them a reason to pause, something stronger than her panic or her voice. Her thoughts spun wildly. She glanced at her brother, who shook his head slightly as if telling her not to do anything reckless. But she couldn't just stand there. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. People around them murmured louder. Some thought the officers were being too harsh. Some believed the brother must have done something if the officers were so sure. Everyone had opinions, but no one had the whole truth. She tightened her jaw, trying to hold back tears. She knew something the officers didn't. She knew something the crowd didn't, and she knew that. Revealing it could completely change the situation, but it could also expose something her brother preferred to keep private. But what choice did she have now? She stepped even closer, her voice softer this time, trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. She told the officers once more that they were wrong, very wrong. She begged them to pause before doing something they couldn't take back. The officers still didn't slow down. Her brother tried again to reassure her, telling her it would be sorted out at the station. But she shook her head. She couldn't let it go that far. She couldn't let him be dragged away when she knew exactly why this was all a misunderstanding. For a moment, time felt like it stopped. The noise from the street faded. The murmurs from the crowd disappeared. All she could hear was the shaky rhythm of her own breath. She looked directly at the lead officer, eyes burning with fear and determination, and prepared to say the one thing she had hoped she would never have to. Reveal what she was about to say would freeze everyone in place. But in that moment before the words left her mouth, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth that would change everything. She stood there with her heart pounding so hard it felt like the whole street could hear it. The officers were still holding her brother by the arms, pushing him gently but firmly toward the squad car. Every second that passed made her feel like time was slipping away from her hands. She knew she had to say something, but the words weren't coming out. They were stuck in her throat, tangled in fear and frustration. Her brother kept telling her to calm down, but she could see worry in his eyes. He was trying to stay brave for her, but the tension on his face told her that even he didn't know how this would end. He wasn't someone who caused trouble. He never looked for fights or arguments. He lived quietly, kept to himself, and followed rules carefully. That's why this moment felt unreal. It didn't fit him. It didn't fit their life. The crowd around them kept growing. People were whispering, some pointing, some shaking their heads. A few kept recording, their phones held high like they were watching a show rather than a real person's life falling apart. She hated that. She hated knowing that someone would go home later, rewatch the clip, talk about it without understanding anything. One of the officers turned to her again, his voice more impatient this time. He told her to step back and let them do their job. He said they didn't want to use any force, and she needed to cooperate. His tone wasn't cruel, but it was cold enough to make her stomach twist. She swallowed hard and stepped toward them again. Her voice was tight, shaking. She told them they were wrong. She told them her brother wasn't the person they were looking for. But once again, they didn't listen. They treated her words like they were just noise in the background. They kept repeating the same things. He matched the description. He was at the wrong place. He didn't answer their questions the way they expected. It wasn't personal. They believed they were following procedure. But for her, this was as personal as it could get. Her legs felt weak, but she didn't back away. She couldn't. She had never felt so powerless, yet so desperate at the same time. It was like she was trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. Forced to watch it unfold in slow motion, the officer near her brother started to reach for the car door, ready to push him inside. That was the moment something inside her snapped. She stepped forward again, her voice cracking as she shouted that they needed to stop right now. She didn't care how many people were watching. She didn't care how foolish she looked. All she cared about was stopping this before it went any further. Her brother called out her name softly, almost pleading with her to stay calm. But calm was impossible now. She looked at him really, looked at him, and she saw more than worry. She saw the one thing he never showed easily: fear. That broke her completely. If he was scared, then this was far more serious than she thought. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She knew she had to speak up, even if it meant exposing something her brother tried so hard to keep private. She knew he might be upset later, but she didn't care. She would rather deal with his frustration than watch him be taken away, because they didn't know who he really was. Her voice came out small at first, trembling and uneven. She told them once again that they were making a big mistake. The officers weren't moved. They continued checking his pockets, securing him, preparing to place him in the car. She looked around the crowd, searching for someone who would step forward and say something, anything, but no one moved. Everyone watched with wide eyes, waiting for the next part of the scene. No one wanted to be the person who challenged the officers directly. Her eyes filled with tears, she tried very hard to blink away. She didn't want to break down in front of everyone. She didn't want her brother to see her fall apart. She needed to be strong for him, for herself, for the truth. The lead officer walked around the car and approached her. His expression was a mix of annoyance and patience that was wearing thin. He told her she was interrupting an active procedure and that her actions weren't helping her brother. His words felt sharp, hitting her harder than he probably realized. She lifted her chin faintly, forcing herself not to crumble. She said she understood they were just doing their job, but they were about to do something they would regret. Her voice shook, but the conviction in it was real. The officer responded with a sigh, asking her if she had any proof of what she was claiming. Proof. The word echoed in her mind like a bell. She did have proof, just not something she ever wanted to show in public. Her brother's voice cut through the noise again. He called out to her, telling her not to say anything. His tone was firm this time, almost commanding. The moment she heard it, she froze. He wasn't asking, he was warning, but the situation had gone too far now. She stared at him, seeing a mixture of fear and frustration in his eyes. She knew exactly what he was afraid of. He didn't want his private identity exposed. He didn't want the attention, the judgment, the questions. He lived his life carefully to avoid moments like this. But she also knew something else. If she stayed silent, he would be taken away. And once he was gone, clearing his name would become a long, painful process. She couldn't let that happen. Not when she had the power to stop it. She looked back at the officer, and her hands slowly reached into the small crossbody bag she had worn over her shoulder. She hesitated for a second, staring down at the zipper as if opening it meant opening a door she couldn't close again. Her breath shook. Her fingers trembled. She knew this moment would change everything. The officer watched her closely, his hand hovering near his radio. The other officers paused their movements, glancing over. Even the crowd seemed to lean in without realizing it, like the street itself was waiting. She finally pulled open the bag, her fingers brushing against the item she had hoped she would never need to use. She felt her throat tighten as memories flashed through her mind, memories of her brother handing her that item, telling her quietly to keep it safe, just in case. He had said those words so calmly, never explaining why, never expecting a moment like this to happen. She looked up at the officer, her eyes filling again, this time with a mix of fear and determination. She told him she had something he needed to see, something that would prove everything she had been saying. Her brother saw what she was about to pull out and shook his head urgently, telling her to stop. His voice was tense, almost pleading, but she couldn't stop now. It was too late. She held the item tightly in her hand, keeping it hidden for a moment as she took one more breath. Her whole body felt like it was shaking. She thought of the consequences. She thought of the attention this would bring. She thought about how it might affect her brother's life and work. But then she thought about something even more important. The look on his face when they grabbed him. That tiny spark of fear he couldn't hide. She couldn't let that fear grow. She couldn't let him be taken somewhere he didn't belong, so she stepped forward again, her voice barely steady but full of resolve. She told the officers that before they made another move. They needed to understand exactly who they were dealing with. She lifted her hand slowly, revealing the truth her brother had tried so hard to keep hidden. The moment her hand opened, everything began to change. Even before anyone spoke, for a moment nothing moved. The street felt strangely quiet, as if even the wind had stopped to see what she was holding in her hand. Her fingers were still trembling, and she held the small black card tightly, afraid she might drop it if her nerves got any worse. The officers stared at her, confused. They didn't know what she was about to reveal, but they could sense the shift in the air. Something was different now. Something serious. Even the crowd seemed to understand that this was no longer a simple argument or misunderstanding. Her brother's face changed instantly. His eyes widened in disbelief. Then frustration washed over him, followed by a look that seemed almost painful. He had told her never to show that card unless absolutely necessary. He never wanted anyone to know who he really was or what he really did. He liked being invisible. He wanted a normal life outside of work. But now, all of that was about to be exposed right here on the street. She ignored the warning in his eyes. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. Her voice shook as she told the officers that before they took him another step, they needed to verify something very important. She lifted the card just a little, enough for them to see the edge of the metallic seal pressed onto it. The officer nearest her froze mid-step. Another officer leaned in slightly, squinting as if trying to make sure he wasn't imagining what he thought he saw. She turned the card so the front faced them fully. There was no mistaking it now. The design was unmistakable, the type of identification only a handful of people carried. It wasn't a regular ID, not a driver's license, not a workplace badge. It was something far more serious. One officer's mouth fell open slightly. Another stepped closer, his expression tightening with realization. The lead officer, the one who had been giving her warnings, took a slow breath and stared at the card, as if it were something explosive. She explained that her brother wasn't the person they thought he was. She told them he worked with a federal task team, the kind that operated quietly, the kind that rarely showed themselves in public. Her voice cracked several times, but she kept talking. Driven by fear and determination, her brother looked away, clenching his jaw in frustration. He didn't want this. He never wanted scenes like this. But there was nothing he could do now. The lead officer held out his hand slowly, asking if he could take the card to verify it. She hesitated only for a moment before placing it in his hand. She watched as he turned it over, checked the back, and then quietly pressed a button on his radio. His voice changed completely. No more impatience. No more cold commands. Now he sounded tense, cautious, almost nervous. He asked dispatch to verify an identification number, reading off the digits slowly and carefully, as if afraid of making a mistake. While he waited for a response, none of the officers moved. They didn't continue to push her brother toward the car. They didn't tighten their grip or loosen it. They simply stood there as though unsure what to do next. She stepped closer to her brother. Her hands were still shaking, but she reached out and touched his arm lightly. He didn't pull away, but he didn't look at her either. His eyes were fixed on the ground, frustration written all over his face. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered, his voice low and tight. "I had to." "Shh," she whispered back. They weren't listening. He didn't answer. He didn't have the energy to argue at that moment. He just closed his eyes for a brief second, trying to steady himself. The street remained tense. Some people put their phones down, sensing that this wasn't something they should be recording anymore. Others kept filming, not really understanding the seriousness of what was happening. The lead officer's radio crackled to life. Everyone seemed to lean in a little, even without meaning to. The officer pressed the radio closer to his ear. The voice on the other side spoke quickly, too quickly for most of the crowd to understand. But whatever was said made the officer stiffen. He thanked dispatch, then lowered the radio. He held the card carefully, almost respectfully, as he approached her brother. He looked at the handcuffs, then back at the card. Then finally, into her brother's eyes. His voice, when he spoke again, was completely different. It was calm, careful, almost apologetic. He called her brother by his full official title. That made several people in the crowd gasp. Her brother finally lifted his head and met the officer's eyes. He didn't say anything, but the hurt in his expression was clear. He had never wanted anyone here to know who he was. He never wanted to be treated differently. But now that truth was out, and there was no taking it back, the officer immediately signaled to the others. They stepped forward quickly but gently, unlocking the cuffs and stepping back with visible discomfort. One officer muttered an apology under his breath. Another shook his head, looking embarrassed. The crowd grew louder now, murmuring again. Some people stared at her brother with wide eyes. Others looked confused. A few even stepped away, as if nervous to stand too close to someone with that level of clearance. Her brother rubbed his wrist slowly, the faint red marks from the cuffs still visible. He didn't say anything. He just kept breathing slowly, trying to calm himself. The lead officer handed the card back to her with both hands, as if it were something fragile. He apologized directly to her as well, saying they hadn't known, saying they had only followed the information they had been given, saying they never intended anything to escalate like this. She nodded shakily. She appreciated the apology, but her emotions were still too raw to respond fully. Her legs felt weak, and she wasn't sure if she was going to sit down or collapse. The officer then turned back to her brother, clearing his throat nervously. He asked if they could talk privately for a moment to understand what had gone wrong and whether they needed to contact his department. Her brother took a slow breath. He still looked frustrated, but he nodded. He knew this wasn't the officer's fault entirely. They were doing their job with the information they had. But the situation had still spiraled into something humiliating and stressful. Before he stepped aside with the officers, he turned to his sister. For the first time since the situation began, his expression softened slightly. He reached out and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her voice didn't come out at first. Her throat was tight. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head faintly, a small sigh leaving him. "We'll talk later." He glanced at the officers, then back at her. "Stay right here." She watched him walk a few steps away with the officers. They stood near the squad car, speaking in low voices. The lead officer kept nodding, listening carefully. Her brother spoke calmly, though she could still see tension in the way he held himself. She stood there quietly, feeling the weight of everything crash down on her. Her hands felt cold. Her heart was still racing. A few people from the crowd approached her, asking what happened, why the officers changed their tone so quickly. She didn't answer any of them. She didn't want to talk to strangers right now. All she cared about was making sure her brother was okay. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Finally, the officers stepped back, thanking her brother again and promising they would file a correction on their end. They looked embarrassed, even shaken. Her brother walked back toward her slowly. He looked tired, not physically, but emotionally drained. She wanted to hug him. She waited for him to speak first. He stopped in front of her and took a deep breath. "You shouldn't have had to do that," she said softly. She lifted her eyes to him. "I couldn't let them take you." He looked at her for a moment, then let out a quiet sigh. "We need to go home," he said. "There's going to be a lot to deal with after this." She nodded. He didn't blame her. He knew she had acted out of fear, out of love. But he also knew the world behind that card was complicated, and revealing it always came with consequences. As they walked away from the scene, people continued whispering and watching them. But she kept her eyes forward, refusing to let the weight of their stares pull her down. She didn't regret what she had done, even if it meant everything was about to change. They walked away from the busy street together. But even after putting some distance between themselves and the crowd, the tension didn't leave them. She could still feel the weight of what had happened pressing down on her chest. Her brother walked beside her in silence, his steps steady but slow. As if each one carried a new thought he wasn't ready to share, when they finally reached a quieter corner a few blocks away, stopped walking. She turned toward him, unsure of what he was thinking. His face was calm but not relaxed. It was the kind of calm a person forces when they're trying not to let frustration spill out. He rubbed his forehead gently, then lowered his hand with a long breath. "You know this is going to cause problems," he said quietly. She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers together nervously. "I didn't know what else to do. They weren't listening to me. They wouldn't even check properly." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't blame her, but she could feel the heaviness in his tone. He had spent years avoiding attention, building a life that allowed him to move quietly without drawing eyes. Revealing his identity wasn't a simple thing. It came with rules, expectations, consequences. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at the situation. After a moment, He sighed and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. I know you were scared. I know you were trying to protect me. But what happened back there? It's going to reach the people I work with. They'll want to know why this happened publicly. Her heart tightened. She felt guilty, but she also knew that in that moment, she had made the only choice she could make. I'm sorry, she whispered. He shook his head. You don't need to apologize, I just wish it hadn't come to that. They stood there quietly until he finally motioned for them to keep walking. Even with everything that had happened, he still made sure she walked on the inside of the sidewalk, away from the edge of the road. It was something he always did, without thinking. A small habit that showed how he cared. As they continued on, she felt her emotions steady slightly. The shock was fading, replaced by exhaustion, but also a quiet worry. What would happen next? Would his job be affected? Would people start asking questions? Would this moment become something he could never escape from? When they reached their home, he unlocked the door and stepped inside first. She followed, closing it behind them with a soft click. The familiar space felt strangely different, as if the weight they carried from outside had followed them in. He sat down on the edge of the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. She took a seat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. For a while, they didn't speak. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm. When people are still catching their breath, finally, he looked up. Tell me exactly what you saw before you came outside, he said. I want to understand how everything started. She took a small breath and explained how she had just stepped out of the store and seen him being pushed toward the wall. How the groceries slipped from her hands. How the officers didn't listen when she tried to explain. How everything had spiraled so quickly that she barely had time to think. He listened closely, nodding gently. His expression softened a little as she spoke. He hadn't known how much she saw, or how scared she really was when she finished. He leaned back slightly and rubbed his hands together. It shouldn't have gone that far, he said. They should have checked first. But misunderstandings happen. That's the job. But you didn't do anything wrong, she said, her voice breaking. You were just standing there. He gave a small, tired smile. Things move fast when people think they're looking at a suspect. It's not always fair, but it's the reality of how things work sometimes. She looked down. I hate that. He didn't answer that. Instead, he stood up and walked to the small table near the window. He picked up a glass of water, took a slow sip, and stared outside for a moment. Then he spoke again, quietly. Someone from the department will call. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. They'll want to know what happened. Will you get in trouble? She asked, her voice small. He shook his head. Not trouble. But they'll ask questions. Her chest tightened again. Because I showed the card? He turned toward her. Because the card was shown in public. It wasn't your fault. You did what you thought you had to do. But they'll want to understand why it was necessary. She nodded slowly. She knew her decision had consequences. But she didn't regret saving him from being taken away. He walked back to the couch and sat down again, his time closer to her. Listen, he said gently. I'm not upset with you. I just didn't expect today to go like that. Me neither, she whispered. He gave a small, breathy laugh, not because he found anything funny, but because the whole situation felt unreal. They sat there together for a few minutes before his phone buzzed loudly on the table. The sound made both of them jump slightly. He reached for it, and when he saw the name on the screen, his face tightened. It's them, he said. She swallowed hard. He answered the call quietly, standing up as he held the phone to his ear. She watched as he listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally giving a short answer. His face stayed serious, calm, but she could see the tension in his eyes. The conversation lasted longer than she expected. She couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but she could tell they were asking a lot of questions. Questions about the officers, about what happened, about the card. Finally, he said a soft, understood, and ended the call. He didn't sit right away. He stayed standing for a moment, thinking. Then he turned toward her. They want me to come in tomorrow morning, he said. They want a full report. She looked down, guilt creeping back in. Because of me? He shook his head. Because of the situation? Not because of you. She looked up at him.
Are you sure?
I'm sure, he said firmly. You didn't do anything wrong? She wasn't sure she believed that. He walked over and sat beside her again. Listen, sometimes things happen that we can't control. Today was one of those days. She nodded, but her chest still felt tight. There's something else, he continued. They want to talk to the officers too. They already contacted them. She blinked. All of them. Yes. She sat back slowly, trying to process everything. What did you tell them? She asked. The truth, he said simply. Exactly what happened? Are you mad that I showed the card? She asked, her voice low. He looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. As they walked, his sister kept asking if he was sure he was all right. Every time, he reassured her with the same calm tone. He told her that the experience had been stressful, but that he was grateful for how it ended. He also told her he admired how she stood up for him even when no one believed her. She smiled a little more each time he said it. A short distance away, one of the officers who had remained behind watched them leave. He looked thoughtful, maybe even reflective. He turned back to his team and said something quiet before walking toward his patrol car. It was clear the moment had left an impact on everyone involved. Later that evening, the department held a brief meeting about the incident. It wasn't a dramatic session, just a clear and serious discussion about what had gone wrong and what needed to change. They reviewed the mistaken identity, the failure to slow down and check properly, and the importance of listening to bystanders when tensions rise. Because the incident had been recorded by so many people. Parts of it quickly went online, clips, spread across social media within hours. And thousands of people watched the moment when everything stopped, the second Daniel's identity was revealed. Many viewers commented on how frightening the experience must have been. Others praised his sister for stepping forward with so much courage. As the videos gained traction, conversations spread about training, communication, and the importance of verifying information before taking action. Many people watching the clip said they had been in similar situations or had seen misunderstandings escalate far too quickly. Others simply expressed relief that the situation had been resolved safely over the next few days. Daniel received messages from people he had worked with in the past. Some thanked him for staying calm in such a stressful moment. Others were shocked that he had even been stopped in the first place. His teammates on the federal project were especially concerned, telling him they hoped he was all right and offering to step in if he needed support. His sister, on the other hand, received her own messages. A few came from people who had been at the scene and wanted to make sure she was okay. Others came from strangers online who had seen the video and were touched by how fiercely she protected her brother. Even though she wasn't used to attention like that, she appreciated the kind words. In the end, life returned to normal, slowly but surely. The event became something they talked about occasionally, though mostly to remind themselves how unpredictable life can be. Whenever the topic came up, Daniel would tell his sister again how grateful he was for her bravery. And every time, she would roll her eyes a little, but smile anyway. What happened that day was something neither of them expected, something that could have gone wrong in many ways. But because of the truth, her determination, and a moment of calm at the right time, everything shifted for the better. And even though the moment was upsetting, created something lasting a stronger trust between the two siblings, a lesson. For the officers involved, and a quiet reminder to everyone who watched it unfold, sometimes the smallest act of courage can change everything around you.